Okay, so I'm assuming you know something about GDP, these spending components that make up GDP, and something about price levels, how to compute them, and so on. So we're using that to build this model, and we're starting out with the first curve, the aggregate demand curve. And so you want to think of this as basically total spending. So all of these spending components that make up GDP are also the components of aggregate demand. So we got consumption, investment, government purchases, net exports. And so first we want to just explain why this thing is downward sloping. So there's going to be two main reasons. There's could be more than that, but the main reasons that we're going to look at are the wealth effect, and this one's pretty straightforward. So just keep in mind, even though this kind of looks like a big version of just a micro supply and demand graph, it's not working the same way. So the reason for the slopes of these curves are not the same as they are in micro. But the wealth effect is pretty straightforward. So basically we're saying that if the price level were to increase, so let's say we're going this way, we're increasing the price level, then your overall wealth in terms of what you can afford to buy, in other words, the purchasing power, you can think of it as the purchasing power of your money or your assets. So if your purchasing power is lower, then your overall demand, your aggregate demand for all the goods that are being produced in the economy is also lower. So just keep in mind it's not the same effect as a micro price going up, because that was always a relative price effect. So if I was just looking at the demand curve for some good, well, the price of that good goes up relative to other things, and that's why I'm buying less of this good, that good, and more of something else. This can't be a relative price effect, because this is the overall price level. So it's working through the effect on your overall purchasing power. And so you're less wealthy, other things being equal, you're always holding other things equal when the price level goes up. So less wealthy just means the overall demand for all of the output that's being produced is lower, so that gives you that downward slope. Okay, so the next effect is a little less straightforward, interest rate effect. So we're just going to walk through how this works. So let's assume that the price level, something's causing the price level to go up. Right now we're not concerned about why that's happening, but we're just explaining why this curve is downward sloping for now. So let's just say something causes the price level to go up, and the result of that is the same as what we just talked about. The purchasing power of your money or your assets is going down, and because of that you want to increase the amount of money that you have, let's say. So borrow money or sell some of your assets, and both of those things have the effect of raising the interest rate. So just imagine a bunch of people trying to borrow money in order to buy things. The price level of everything at the store is higher, so people need more money to go make purchases. So you might think of it just in terms of borrowing money. So everyone's trying to borrow money, that drives up the interest rate. And when the interest rate is higher, other things being equal, investment is now more expensive. And now, because of that higher interest rate, it makes consumption less attractive relative to just saving your money and earning that interest rate. So lower investment and lower consumption as a result of that higher interest rate, and therefore that means a lower level of aggregate demand. So remember, aggregate demand just meaning total spending on all those components: consumption, investment, government spending, net exports. So and this is happening as a result of a price level change. So because of that, it's a movement along the curve. Any graph where whatever is on your axis is changing, that's just a movement along the curve. So this whole string of effects here is just a result of that price level change. That's why it's still a movement along the curve. So that's the interest rate effect. So for now, those are really the two reasons that we're going to have for the downward sloping aggregate demand curve. Okay, so now what can shift this curve? Now remember, spending components. Any of those spending components, so for some reason consumption changes, investment changes, for basically any reason, you're going to get a shift to this curve. So at any given price level, people want to buy more, invest more, and so on. So increase in aggregate demand, shift to the right; decrease in aggregate demand, shift to the left. A couple major shifts that we usually are going to have here. So expectations about the economy, again, something causing people to want to consume more, invest more, and so on at any given price level, not as a result of a price level change. So that's going to be a shift in aggregate demand, confidence about the economy, something like that. People just decide they want to spend more. A wealth change, so this is different from the wealth effect, because now we're talking about at any given price level, people are wealthier, as opposed to the result of a price level change. So remember, before we were talking about your purchasing power changing because of a price level change. Now we're talking about your purchasing power changes because of a wealth change that is not a result of a price level change. So stock market goes up or something like that, people are wealthier, housing prices, something like that, people want to spend more, so increase aggregate demand. Other major one that we'll have is government policy, meaning fiscal or monetary policy. Fiscal policy meaning increase spending, cut taxes. That would be a stimulus, increase in aggregate demand. If you decrease spending or you raise taxes, that would be contractionary, decrease aggregate demand. Also monetary policy, increase money supply. So for now you don't have to worry about how monetary policy works, but more money being created, increase spending, increase aggregate demand. So those are going to be your major shifts. All right, next curve, short run aggregate supply curve. So here we're going to have to make a distinction between the short run and the long run. You don't need to do that for aggregate demand. It's just total spending at any given price level. But you'll see why we have to talk about short run versus long run when we're talking about aggregate supply. So basically the relationship seems pretty intuitive. Remember, now we're talking about the supply side of our economy, so firms producing stuff, right? The firms that produce all the stuff that make up GDP. So, and all we're saying is that other things being equal and the price level is higher, firms are willing to produce more. Firms want to produce more. So higher price level, firms are supplying more, producing more. So that seems pretty straightforward, but there is a key assumption here that we have to make in order for that to be true. So remember, firms are profit maximizing, right? Total revenue minus total cost. And so what's happening to price level, other things being equal, is basically what's happening to our revenues. So revenues are going up, right? We're selling stuff for some final price, and so revenues are going up. Well, if revenues were going up when the price level went up and costs went up the same amount, then that wouldn't affect profit, and there'd be no reason for firms to want to be producing more. So it must be that costs are not changing as quickly as that price level, and so that's going to be true. So if there's any costs that are lagging behind that change in price level, then that's the reason why firms are going to be willing to produce more, because they're more profitable, right? Revenues are going up, costs are staying the same, or at least not rising as quickly. Firms are going to be more profitable. And the major cost that we're usually going to be thinking about is the wage cost. So this is really the key assumption of this entire model, is that wages are sticky. In other words, wages don't adjust as quickly as other things, as the price level in this case. And there's a couple of reasons for that. So, labor is usually on some kind of annual contract, for example, and so they don't adjust as quickly. And there's also the kind of psychological effect of, particularly on the downside, firms don't want to immediately cut people's wages as soon as there's an economic downturn, for example. So wages will tend to be stuck for a while, particularly on the downside. But as long as we assume there's some stickiness to wages, then that's what gets you this upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve. And there could be other reasons, sticky prices, for example, some prices being stickier than others, but for us the main reason is going to be the sticky wage assumption. So that's kind of going to be driving this entire model, the results of this model, and it's going to get us these business fluctuations that we're going to see. So shifts of this curve, remember, any curve that we're talking about, if just the price level is changing, we're moving along this curve. Something other than prices are changing, then we're shifting the curve. So remember, wages in the short run are stuck. So as long as I'm on this curve, we're going to assume wages are stuck at a certain level. But as soon as wages do adjust, they will eventually adjust. So nominal wages, the dollar amount of wages, will adjust eventually, and when they do, that's going to be a shift, because just think of it as cost of production changing. So let's say nominal wages adjust upward. Well, that's like a cost increase for all these firms that are producing, and so other things being equal, we're going to decrease short run aggregate supply. I didn't show it here, but that would be a shift to the left. So at any given price level, firms want to produce less, given that their costs have gone up, given that the wage cost of producing has gone up. Other things being equal, firms want to produce less at any given price level. So nominal wages adjusting. Kind of a separate thing, but related, is when expected inflation changes, and we'll see this again later on. But so let's say workers are expecting 2% inflation, well, that's kind of priced into their wage contracts. And so when that expected inflation goes up, workers basically expect to get a raise, demand to get a raise. And remember, firms are competing for workers, so at some point they have to respond to that. Well, so we assume that when expected inflation changes, we're going to assume that's going to be reflected in nominal wages. So usually we assume that it just adjusts right away. It's not completely realistic, but in terms of our model, we're going to assume that when expected inflation changes, wages will adjust in order to pay those higher wages to keep up with inflation. So higher expected inflation, we'd expect nominal wages to be going up to basically to keep up with inflation. So again, that's also going to decrease short run aggregate supply. And we could also go in the other direction. But you should think of the major shifter here as being something that increases costs or decreases costs. So some input price, so let's say we're a manufacturer, steel, the price of steel might be an input. Well, that's part of our costs. Again, labor cost is a major part of our costs. So something increases cost of production, commodity prices, things like oil, agricultural goods, metals, something like that. Those are commodity prices. So all of those could affect costs of production. So higher cost, decrease short run aggregate supply, lower cost, increase short run aggregate supply, shift to the right.